Everyone knows South Park went to war with Family Guy. 2 episodes, a tank full of manatees, the most famous insult one cartoon ever aimed at another. Seth MacFarlane watched all of it and did something nobody expected. He agreed with them. In this video, we break down every time South Park called out Family Guy. The 2 weeks that started everything. 2 cartoons sat on rival networks through the middle of the 2000s, both aimed at more or less the same young audience, and both willing to put things on television that almost no other show would touch. Each of them was also quietly certain that the other one was going about it the wrong way. One of them had spent nearly a decade building a reputation as the show that would say anything at all. The other had been canceled twice, dragged back to life by DVD sales and late-night reruns, and turned into the most quoted comedy on television almost by accident. What happened between them played out entirely through jokes, aimed at writers, about writing, in front of an audience that mostly had no idea a fight was happening at all. This is the story of how South Park spent 2 weeks in the spring of 2006 explaining to a national audience exactly what it thought of Family Guy, and how that explanation ended up outliving almost everything else either show ever made. That first episode went out on a Wednesday night in April of 2006, the 3rd episode of South Park's 10th season, written and directed by Trey Parker himself. It ended without an ending, which was something the show had almost never done in 9 years on the air. The whole design of South Park ran against the idea of a 2-part story. Parker and Stone had spent years telling anybody who asked that they could turn an entire episode around in about 6 days, close enough to the news that they could react to something while people were still talking about it. Splitting a story across 2 weeks threw that whole advantage away, for reasons nobody watching at home could see yet. Whatever they were doing that April, they had decided it was worth giving up the one thing that made their show different from everything else on television. The episode opens on a scene that belongs in a disaster movie rather than a cartoon comedy. Families run out of their houses in the dark, screaming, piling into cars, and heading for the middle of town in a panic that arrives fully formed before anybody has explained what the emergency actually is. The staging is a direct lift from a Steven Spielberg film about an alien invasion that had been in theaters the previous summer, shot with the same handheld camera work and the same sense that ordinary suburban life is coming apart in real time. The town ends up barricaded inside the community center, doors locked, everybody waiting for something terrible to happen. Randy Marsh explains the emergency to the room, and the explanation turns out to be that a cartoon is going to show the Prophet Muhammad on television. That is the entire threat. Randy then delivers a line that establishes the intelligence level of everything that follows, telling the crowd that if they are still alive in the morning, they will know for certain that they are not dead. Morning arrives and nothing has happened, because the network censored the image at the last second, and the crisis that emptied every house in town evaporates before breakfast. Nobody had checked anything. Nobody had asked who saw the episode or where the rumor came from, and the whole population had organized itself around a threat that never existed. Randy stands outside in his bathrobe and damns Family Guy to hell, which is the first thing the audience learns about the target of this entire 2-part story. Before a single frame of parody has played, before anybody has explained what the complaint actually is, the show has already established that Family Guy is the thing that nearly got the whole town killed. The timing of all this mattered enormously, because the episode was not inventing its crisis out of nothing. A Danish newspaper had published a set of cartoons depicting Muhammad in the autumn of 2005, and through the early months of 2006, the response to those drawings turned violent across several countries. Embassies were attacked, and people were killed. Newspapers all over the world spent months arguing about whether to reprint the images before the overwhelming majority of them decided not to. American networks were watching every bit of that unfold, and none of them had any appetite whatsoever for being the next name in the story. When the fictional Fox network inside this episode censors an image at the last second out of fear, the joke is closer to reporting than to satire. Kyle and the others sit down to watch the Family Guy episode everybody is panicking about, and this is the moment where the real target of the 2-part story finally comes into view. What plays on screen is a stretch of Family Guy in which Lois is embarrassed because Peter has invited an old girlfriend to dinner. The scene has a premise, a conflict, and somewhere for the story to go, and then it stops dead 3 separate times for jokes that have nothing to do with any of it. One of them has Peter remembering the time he auditioned to be the talking car from an old television show about a crime-fighting vehicle, and discovering that he cannot do the voice. The second has Peter selling pancakes to a famous science fiction starship captain, who then sings a soft rock song from the 1970s at him for no reason anybody could explain. The third is the one the entire 2-part story eventually turns on, and it involves Peter and the Prophet Muhammad buying a glass of tea together from a large man best known for wearing gold chains on television in the 1980s. None of those jokes connect to the dinner party, or to each other, or to anything at all, and none of them are meant to. What makes the parody land as an insult rather than as gentle ribbing thing is how accurate it is, right down to the rhythm of the setup line and the exact length of each detour before the show snaps back to the story it abandoned. Trey Parker did not write a stupid, exaggerated version of Family Guy to make it easy to mock. He wrote a version that works exactly the way the real thing works, then let it sit there in front of an audience that recognized it immediately. Gerald Broflovsky walks into the room, sees what his son is watching, and destroys the television with a baseball bat, and Sheila responds to the whole business by proposing that the boys attend Muslim sensitivity training at school the following morning. That training arrives, and because it is delivered by Mrs. Garrison, it goes about as badly as anything in Springfield ever has. Her theory, delivered to a classroom of 9 and 10-year-olds, is that Muslims are frustrated because their religion forbids sex outside marriage and forbids masturbation, and because a great many of them live somewhere hot and sandy where the weather makes everything worse. She lays the whole thing out in one long escalating sentence about a Friday night with no sex available, sand in uncomfortable places, and then a cartoon arriving from a country where people are having a considerably better time, mocking the prophet. The joke there works on 2 levels at the same time, which is how the show usually builds this kind of material. On the surface, a teacher is saying something wildly offensive to a room full of small children who have no way to know how wrong it is. Underneath that, the episode is making a sharper point about what sensitivity training actually produces in practice. An institution panics, orders a session, and hands that session to whoever happened to be free that morning, who then explains an entire faith through the narrowest possible lens and calls the result understanding. Cartman objects to the lecture, calls it ignorant and racist, and turns out to be completely correct, which is a rare position for him to occupy. His actual point is narrower than his outrage suggests, and it plants the seed of the entire plot. Muslims, he says, are angry about Family Guy, and not about anything Mrs. Garrison has just spent 5 minutes describing. The town buries their heads in the field anyway, an entire population kneeling with their faces underground and their backsides in the air, waiting for danger to pass over them. Nothing about the plan survives a moment of inspection, because a person with their head buried cannot be seen avoiding anything, and the gesture only works as a signal if somebody is watching. Then the school assembly delivers the twist that restarts the panic, which is that the Family Guy episode everybody is frightened of turns out to be a 2-part story, with the second half airing the following week, uncensored, with the image intact. That structure is the joke pointing directly at itself, because South Park is running a 2-part story about a 2-part story, and in 7 days the real second half will face the exact same decision the fictional one does. Parker built a trap for his own network and then walked into it in public, with an audience of several million people watching to see what would happen. From that point, the episode belongs entirely to Eric Cartman, who stands up in front of the town and argues for censorship using the language of compassion and public safety. People could be hurt. Innocent lives are at stake. Somebody in this room has to be responsible enough to stop it before something terrible happens. He is enormously persuasive, because he always is, and the adults around him begin moving in the direction he wants them to move. He also aims one specific weapon directly at Kyle, asking him how he would feel if there were a cartoon on television that made fun of Jewish people all the time, week after week, for years. That question does exactly what Cartman intends it to do. Kyle has no clean answer available, and he starts feeling guilty about a position he had been perfectly comfortable holding 10 minutes earlier. What finishes the job is a nightmare, in which Kyle dreams a nuclear sequence staged like a science fiction film from the early 1990s, and watches his little brother Ike get lured away to an ice cream shop and killed by terrorists. He wakes up converted, agrees to travel to Los Angeles with Cartman, and sets out to get the episode pulled. The adults, meanwhile, arrive at their own solution, and it comes from a professor at the local university. He proposes that the entire town bury their heads in the sand, so that any extremist watching from anywhere in the world can see clearly that these people took no part in the parody and are looking at completely nothing. Cartman packs for the road trip with real care, and the show inventories his supplies in detail, from the cheese-flavored snacks to the snack cakes to the donuts to the 2 different brands of soda. Then it sends him across the entire country on a big wheel, which is the kind of detail South Park has never once bothered to justify to anybody. Kyle catches up with him out on the highway, and the confrontation that follows is the single most important scene in the episode, because Cartman drops the act completely. He does not care about Muslims, and he never did. He wants Family Guy taken off the air for exactly one reason, which is that other children keep telling him his sense of humor reminds them of Family Guy, and the comparison has been eating at him for months. Then he explains his strategy, and the strategy is considerably sharper than anybody expects from him. Get one episode pulled, he says, and every other pressure group in the country immediately learns that the show can be pushed around, and they line up to take their turn. The show loses credibility, then it loses its nerve, then it dies, and he cites a real sitcom from the 1970s as the precedent for exactly how that process works. Next comes the part that made this episode matter far beyond its own 22 minutes. Cartman insists that his jokes are inherent to the story he is telling, telling, that they come out of what has already happened and who it is happening to, and that they carry weight precisely because of everything that came before them. The rival show, in his account, simply swaps one joke for another without anything holding them together. Sit with the construction of that scene for a second, because it explains a great deal about how Parker chose to fight this fight. He took the criticism he holds, the one he would spend the following 20 years repeating in interviews and commentary tracks, and he put it in the mouth of the worst person on his show. Cartman is a liar, a bigot, and a murderer, and in this scene he is also articulating a real position about comedy writing that Parker believes completely. That choice gives Parker cover, and it gives the argument a strange kind of force at the same time. Anybody who objects to the criticism finds that the criticism belongs to Cartman. Anybody who agrees with it finds that they have just agreed with Cartman. The chase that follows is pure slapstick. Cartman distracts Kyle by shouting that a country music star is standing nearby, then uses his snack supplies as improvised weapons in a sequence staged like a spy film, running Kyle off the road until his tricycle goes over a cliff and explodes. Kyle survives, drops to his knees on the pavement, and shouts that he will not let Cartman win, and Cartman shouts something considerably ruder back at him and keeps riding west. A last thread belongs to the network, where the President of the United States arrives at Fox to argue for censorship on national security grounds. The president of the network tells him there is something very strange about the Family Guy writing staff that he needs to know about before he goes any further. He does not say what it is. The credits roll over music from a film Parker and Stone had made 2 years earlier, and a show that had spent 9 years bragging that it never made anybody wait for anything had just made its entire audience wait a full week for an answer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Nobody watching that cliffhanger guessed what was waiting inside the building, and almost nobody who has heard the answer since has ever forgotten it. The secret the network president was holding back had nothing to do with lawyers or executives or anything a television studio would normally worry about. It was an explanation of how Family Guy gets written. It was cruel enough that people were still repeating it 20 years later. Section 2. 5 manatees and a machine. Every television comedy has a room somewhere with people sitting in it, arguing about jokes, throwing out ideas that die on the table, and keeping the handful that survive. That room is the part of the business nobody outside it ever sees, and it is where the actual work of a show gets done, week after week, for as long as the series stays on the air. When a rival wants to insult a show at the deepest level available, the room is the thing they go after, because attacking the room means attacking the people rather than the product. This is the story of what South Park claimed it found inside the Family Guy writing room, and how a single image of 5 sea mammals floating in a tank became the most repeated criticism in the history of American animation. The answer to the cliffhanger arrived on the following Wednesday, in the 4th episode of that same 10th season, again written and directed by Trey Parker, and the episode opened by refusing to deliver the thing everybody had waited a week to see. An announcer states plainly that the thrilling conclusion will not be shown tonight. In its place comes a Terrence and Phillip special, with a title card designed to look like the cover of an old boy's adventure novel from the middle of the last century. Longtime viewers recognized the trick instantly, because South Park had done exactly the same bait and switch 8 years earlier, promising to reveal the identity of Cartman's father and delivering a full episode of Terrence and Phillip instead. That original prank had enraged people who had waited months for an answer and received a Canadian fart cartoon. Reusing it here was not laziness on anybody's part, because Parker was reminding his audience that he had withheld a promised payoff before, deliberately, and that he remained entirely comfortable doing it again. Far from being filler, the fake special at all, Terrence and Phillip meet Muhammad at a cattle ranch. One of them mentions having read all about him in the Quran, and then the Canadian Broadcasting Company censors the character with a black bar that follows him around the screen wherever he goes. Furious about it, the pair storm into the network president's office and demand an explanation, and he tells them he censored the image because he was frightened of an attack by Muslim extremists. Then he adds, almost as an afterthought, that their show has gotten too preachy anyway. The two reasons that executive gives arrive together in the same breath, and they contradict each other completely. He is frightened of violence, and he also thinks the show has gotten worse, and he offers both explanations as though they carry equal weight and belong in the same sentence. That is how censorship decisions usually get explained in practice, with the fear arriving first and the aesthetic objection showing up afterward to make the fear sound like a considered judgment about quality. Back on the Fox lot, Cartman runs into Bart Simpson, who tells him he hates Family Guy too, which is the first sign in either episode that this fight has allies elsewhere in the industry. The two of them then compete over which of them is more evil and therefore better qualified to stop the episode from airing. Bart offers the theft of the head from the town statue as his greatest crime, and Cartman counters by mentioning the time he ground a boy's parents into chili and fed them to him. Bart concedes the point and walks away, calling Cartman a name that cannot be repeated here, and he turns up later at a chalkboard, writing out the sentence that he hates Family Guy over and over. Using Bart that way was a deliberate signal about where South Park stood in relation to the other big animated show on television. He is not a target in this episode, but a colleague. Cartman out-evils him, and he takes it well, and the two shows part on terms that look a great deal like professional respect between people who understand each other's work. Cartman gets inside the building using a con that is close to inspired, presenting himself as a crippled Danish boy on a tiny crutch whose cartoonist father was killed by terrorists during the controversy over the Danish drawings. The performance is a straight lift from a Victorian Christmas story, complete with the pathetic voice and the oversized eyes, and the Fox executives are moved to tears and let him in to address the writing staff directly. Notice what that con actually exploits, because Cartman is not lying about the world at all. The Danish cartoon crisis was real, cartoonists were threatened over it, and people had died in the months that followed. He simply attaches himself to a true tragedy and lets the executives fill in everything else, which they do enthusiastically, because a small crying boy holding a crutch is a considerably easier thing to respond to than a policy question about free expression. Kyle, meanwhile, hitches a ride into Hollywood with a Family Guy superfan, gets intercepted the moment he arrives, and ends up knocked unconscious and locked inside a supply shed by Bart Simpson, which leaves Cartman standing alone in front of the writers with nobody left to stop him. No writing room is waiting for him anywhere in that building, because what the Family Guy staff actually turns out to be is a tank. 5 manatees swim around inside it, and the show bothers to give every one of them a name, listing them as Gretchen, Flubber, Tigger, Pete, and Lucy. Floating in the water alongside them are dozens of plastic balls, each printed with a single item, sometimes a noun, sometimes a verb, sometimes a celebrity or a piece of pop culture that meant something 20 years earlier. The manatees nudge those balls toward a chute, and every time 5 of them go in together, a machine at the far end assembles the contents into a Family Guy cutaway. A staffer explains the operation with total sincerity, the way a man describes a functioning department to a visitor who has asked a reasonable question about workflow. We then watch the machine working, and the combination it selects is exact rather than approximate. Laundry, date, winning, Mexico, Gary Coleman. The staffer looks at the 5 balls sitting in the chute and calls it a perfect Family Guy joke. What comes out the other end is a cutaway in which Peter wins a date in Mexico with the actor Gary Coleman, who delivers the catchphrase everybody remembers him for. 5 unrelated items go in, and 1 gag comes out, and the arithmetic is where the cruelty lives, because the number never changes and never bends. Not 4 items and not 7, but 5, every single time, forever, which turns the whole process into a quota rather than a failure of effort or care. Laziness would mean somebody could not be bothered on a particular afternoon. A quota means the number is the only thing anybody in the room is trying to hit. Order does not matter either, and neither do the contents, because any 5 items will produce a usable joke when the joke does not have to connect to anything happening around it. Parker built a machine that proves its own argument simply by running, and then he put that machine on television twice in the same episode so nobody could miss the point. Then the episode does something considerably smarter than the insult itself. Cartman needs one specific idea ball removed from the tank, because removing it stops the Muhammad gag from ever being written, and the staff explained to him that this cannot be done. The manatees will not work at all if a single ball is taken away from them. Their position, as the staffer describes it, is that either everything is available to write about or nothing is, and they will not accept anything in between. He calls them very ethical writers when he says it. He also mentions, in passing, that they are the only mammals in the world completely unmoved by terrorist threats. Consider where that leaves everybody else in the story, because the animals introduced as an insult turn out to be the only characters in the whole 2-part story who hold the correct line on censorship. The town buried its head in a field, and the network spent the episode negotiating, while the President of the United States applied pressure from the top and the executives looked for a way out. The sea mammals floating in the tank are the only ones who refuse to compromise on anything at all. Cartman, being Cartman, exploits that immediately. He removes a ball in secret, freezes the entire tank, and then walks into the network president's office and reframes the work stoppage as a labor dispute rather than a principle. The manatees, he explains, are spoiled prima donnas who have been taking advantage of the network's generosity for years. The president buys the story completely, announces that he has finished letting prima donna manatees tell him what to do, and moves to pull the episode using a code that begins with the words 00 destruct, borrowed from an old science fiction series. Cartman watches his plan land and declares himself God. Kyle escapes by talking Bart around, telling him he is on a slippery slope toward becoming a monster like Cartman, and when Cartman finds out about it, his only complaint is that Kyle gave Bart one of his speeches. The two of them end up in a slap fight that rolls through the offices of King of the Hill, another animated series on the same lot. plot, and the staff of that show barely react to two children fighting over censorship policy in their corridor. The standoff arrives in the president's office, where Cartman pulls a gun and Kyle argues, and the argument Kyle makes is the one Parker actually cared about putting on television. Kyle concedes the point immediately, agreeing that people can get hurt and saying plainly that this is precisely how terrorism functions. Then he tells the executive that giving into that is what allows terrorism to work in the first place, and asks him to do the right thing. That speech was not invented for the episode at all, because it came out of the arguments Parker and Stone were having with their own network while the story was still in production. The audience watching at home was hearing a transcript of a real meeting, dressed up as a cartoon and delivered by a fourth grader. The president agrees, the Family Guy episode airs uncensored inside the story, and then the actual ending happens, and it was not written by anybody at South Park. Peter compares getting a pink slip at work to the time Muhammad handed him a salmon helmet while he was wearing a toga. At the moment the character should appear on screen, everything goes black. A line of plain text explains that in this shot, Muhammad hands a football helmet to Family Guy, and that Comedy Central has refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad on their network. Most retellings of this story get the next part wrong, and the correction matters, because that scene was animated. Parker and Stone drew it, finished it, and delivered it to the network with Muhammad looking perfectly ordinary and handing Peter a football helmet with a dead salmon sitting on top of it. They refused to remove the shot when they were asked. Comedy Central refused to broadcast it, and the network inserted that black card on their own end after receiving the finished episode. So a two-part story arguing that networks capitulate the moment somebody frightens them was, at the exact moment of its climax, capitulated on by its own network, live, in front of the audience, with the network's own name printed on the explanation. Plenty of viewers watching at home assumed the black card was part of the joke, and both readings were available in the moment, which is the whole problem. A viewer in April of 2006 had no way of knowing whether a black screen explaining that Muhammad had been removed was a satirical flourish or a genuine act of corporate censorship, because the two things look identical from a sofa. The episode has one more move left, and it is the sharpest thing in either half. Al-Qaeda airs its retaliation cartoon, introduced by a senior figure in the organization. What follows is a crudely drawn sequence in which the President of the United States, a television fashion presenter, two movie stars, and Jesus Christ defecate on one another and on the American flag, with the South Park production staff appearing in it doing the same. None of it is censored in any way, and all of it airs exactly as drawn. Read the contrast the episode has just constructed, because it is doing the work of the entire two-parter in about 15 seconds. A calm image of Muhammad standing still and handing over a piece of sports equipment was blocked by the network, while Jesus defecating on the President of the United States went out completely untouched. Osama bin Laden then delivers the thesis of the entire two-part story in plain language, telling the camera that if you look closely at the writing in Family Guy, the jokes never derive from the plot. That sentence is what Parker had spent 44 minutes of television building toward, and he handed it to the most hated man alive. Reviews arrived quickly, and they were extraordinary, because Eric Goldman at IGN gave the second half a perfect score and an Editor's Choice Award the day after it aired, having given the first half a 7 out of 10 a week earlier. Entertainment Weekly ran a piece by Scott Brown on the day of broadcast, noting that the Muhammad material should have been the flashpoint of the whole affair, and that instead, everybody in the country was talking about Family Guy. Comedy Central issued a statement the following day, saying that in light of recent world events, they felt they had made the right decision. The sentence does not defend a principle, or mention comedy, or explain anything at all. It points at world events, which is a phrase that means everybody already knows what happened, and nobody is going to say it out loud. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A fish tank is a strange way to make an argument about writing, and it only worked because there was a real theory sitting underneath it. Parker and Stone teach that theory to film students and built their entire show around it. Once anybody knows the rule they actually follow, every joke in the Manatee episode starts reading differently. Section 3. The rule they actually follow. Every story that works has something invisible holding it together, a set of joins between one moment and the next that a viewer never notices unless somebody points them out. Most people who watch television have no vocabulary for describing those joins, and simply know that some episodes feel like they are going somewhere while others feel like a series of things happening in a row. The people who write for a living do have a vocabulary for it, and Trey Parker and Matt Stone have spent years handing theirs to anybody who asks, in interviews, in commentary tracks, and once in a university classroom in front of a camera crew. This is the story of the rule that South Park is built on, and why understanding it turns the Manatee tank from an insult into an argument. Osama bin Laden says the quiet part out loud at the very end of Cartoon Wars Part 2, telling the camera that if you look closely at the writing in Family Guy, the jokes never derive from the plot. Nothing about that line is is a throwaway, because it states the entire criticism in a single sentence, and it comes out of a real theory of writing that Parker and Stone have taught in public more than once. In 2011, the two of them turned up unannounced in a class at a New York film school, in a course on storytelling strategies, filmed for a television program aimed at students. What they explained that afternoon is the rule their entire show runs on, and it is short enough to fit on the back of a napkin without crowding. Write out your story beats, they said, and then look at the words that belong in the gaps between them. If the words that fit are "and then," Parker told the room, you are in serious trouble, and the script is already broken. What should sit between every single beat is either the word therefore or the word but, and nothing else will do the job properly. Consider how simple that is once somebody says it plainly. This happened, therefore that happened. This happened, but that happened instead. Every beat either causes the next one or complicates it, which means that pulling any single beat out of the middle collapses everything downstream, because everything downstream depended on the thing you just removed. Stone put the failure case in even plainer language when his turn came. You see films sometimes, he said, where this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens after that. What you are watching in those cases is not a movie at all, and it is not a story either. None of that is a matter of taste or house style, because it functions as a load-bearing test that anybody can apply to anything. Run it across a scene, and the weak joins show up immediately, since "and then" is a join that carries no weight whatsoever, and simply lets a writer move from one place to another without earning the move. Parker and Stone teach it because it is the fastest way to find out whether a story is actually a story, and because everything else in a script can be repaired later, while a chain of unconnected events cannot be repaired at all. Take a real example through the test, and watch what happens. A boy skips school, therefore his mother finds out about it, but he lies to her about where he was. Therefore she telephones the teacher to check, but the teacher covers for him without knowing why. Every link in that chain carries weight, and pulling any one of them out stops the rest from working. Now run the version that fails. A boy skips school, and then his mother bakes a cake, and then a helicopter lands in the garden, and then everybody goes to bed. 4 events happen in sequence, and not one of them causes another, so the order could be shuffled into any arrangement at all, and nobody watching would notice the difference. Go back to the tank with that rule in your head, and the joke changes shape completely. The idea balls are "and then," made physical and floating in water where an audience can look at them. Laundry, and then date, and then winning, and then Mexico, and then Gary Coleman. 5 items in a row with no causal relationship between any of them, fed into a machine that has no need for one, producing a joke that could be lifted out of the episode entirely without changing a single thing around it. Parker did not build a random insult about sea mammals because it sounded funny in the room. He built a physical model of the exact failure mode he teaches film students to avoid, and then he put that model in a fish tank and let a national audience watch it run. Cartman had already stated the positive version of the same argument an episode earlier, Out on the Highway with Kyle. His jokes, he insists, are inherent to the story he is telling. They come out of what has happened and who it is happening to, and they carry weight because of everything that came before them. The rival show, in his account, swaps one joke for another without anything holding them together. Interchangeable is the operative idea in that speech, and it is what gives the whole attack its unusual staying power. The claim can be tested rather than merely asserted, which is rare in arguments about comedy, where most disagreements come down to whether somebody laughed. Anybody sitting at home can run the test in about 30 seconds. Take a Family Guy cutaway, lift it out of the episode, and ask whether anything around it changes as a result. Usually nothing does. Drop the same cutaway into a different episode from a different season entirely, and ask whether a viewer would notice the seam. Usually they would not. Nobody has ever treated that portability as a secret, and it is not a flaw in execution either. The device is built to be self-contained precisely so that it can survive being placed anywhere in the schedule, which is exactly what makes it useful to a writing room, and exactly what makes it indefensible under the therefore and but test. Both things are true simultaneously, and the argument never resolved because both sides were describing the same mechanism and disagreeing only about whether it was a problem. A genuine case exists for that device, and it deserves making properly rather than being waved away. A joke that cannot find a home is still a joke, and a show built to hold those jokes can produce a considerably higher raw laugh count per episode than a show that throws away everything failing to serve the plot. On pure volume, the second model loses badly, and everybody involved knows it. The cutaway also does something a conventional scene simply cannot do, which is move instantly and without cost. It can go anywhere, to any period in history, with any character, for 8 seconds, and then vanish again with no setup, no travel, and no explanation required. For a writing room that thinks in premises rather than in stories, that is an enormously efficient tool, and there is no honest reason to pretend otherwise. Cutaways are also considerably older than either show involved in this argument. Sketch comedy has always worked this way, and so did the variety stages that came before it, where an evening was a sequence of unconnected acts acts, and nobody in the audience expected the juggler to set up the singer. Family Guy essentially imported a sketch structure into a sitcom shell and let a nominal plot hold the pieces loosely together while the real work happened in the detours. Understood that way, Parker's complaint is really that the show is a sketch program wearing the costume of a story, which is a fair description of the thing and not obviously a criticism, unless you have already decided that stories occupy the higher ground. A large part of the disagreement comes down to how the two shows were physically made, and the difference between them is enormous rather than marginal. South Park ran on a 6-day production week, which meant the episode broadcast on a Wednesday had frequently been started the previous Thursday, with scripts rewritten while animation was already in progress, and dialogue sometimes recorded within hours of broadcast. Those mechanics explain the philosophy better than any interview ever could. Nothing can be banked when there is no time to bank it, and under those conditions, a writer physically cannot stop and construct an elaborate, unrelated sequence for later use. Whatever goes on screen has to serve the thing already moving, because there is no time to build anything else, and the constraint eventually hardened into a principle. Family Guy worked on the opposite model entirely, with long lead times, scripts locked months ahead, animation handled overseas, and the better part of a year sitting between the writing room and the broadcast. That schedule permits something South Park structurally cannot do, which is accumulation, letting a room gather hundreds of jokes across months and place the strongest ones wherever they happen to fit. Neither approach is illegitimate, and both produce successful television, but they produce different objects for different reasons. The schedules also explain why the two shows fight about this at all instead of ignoring each other, because a 6-day week forces every decision through the story, while a 12-month pipeline lets a room separate joke writing from story writing completely. Once those two jobs are separated, the people doing them start disagreeing about which one is the actual work. What is striking about South Park's full run is how rarely Parker returned to the subject after 2006, because for a feud carrying this much reputation, the on-screen record is oddly thin. 2 years later, in an episode from the 12th season broadcast in the spring of 2008, Terrence and Phillip go off the air, and Stan suggests the group watch Family Guy instead, and Cartman refuses to stoop that low and destroys the television rather than sit through it. Small as that beat is, it does real work, because 2 years after the two-parter, with no plot reason to mention Family Guy at all, the writers reached for it as shorthand. The audience was expected to understand instantly why Cartman would rather destroy a television than watch it, which means the Manatee episode had already done its job, and the position had become a known fact about the character. Beyond that, the trail runs cold almost entirely. A background gag in an episode from the 11th season lists Family Guy among a character's favorite shows on a social media profile, though that detail rests on fan-maintained sources rather than anything official. An episode from the 16th season has Randy watching a film directed by Seth MacFarlane, which is a reference to the man rather than to the show, and both of those should be flagged rather than asserted. Anybody building a list of South Park attacks on Family Guy should be honest that the confirmed total comes to 2 episodes and 1 throwaway line, which reframes the whole feud considerably. 20 years of reputation, an insult that entered the language, 3 writing rooms taking sides, and the on-screen evidence amounts to roughly 45 minutes of television broadcast across 8 days in April of 2006. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything covered so far happened on screen, where a criticism can hide behind a character, and a joke can always be waved off as nothing more than a joke. Then Parker and Stone started sitting down for interviews and recording commentary tracks. What they said with no story wrapped around it turned out to be harsher than anything they ever animated. Section 4. What they said when the cameras were off. A commentary track is a strange kind of document, recorded months after an episode airs, for an audience small enough that everybody involved knows exactly who is listening. The people who buy a box set and then sit through the same episode a second time with 2 writers talking over it are not casual viewers, and the men doing the talking know that perfectly well. What gets said on those tracks tends to be considerably blunter than anything the same people would offer a reporter, because a magazine interview travels, and a commentary track mostly does not. This is the story of what Trey Parker and Matt Stone said about Family Guy when they thought only the fans were listening, and how those recordings turned out to contain the harshest material in the entire feud. The box set arrived in August of 2007, 16 months after the 2-part story aired, and somewhere on the commentary track for those episodes, Parker stops performing entirely and simply answers the question. He says they do hate it. He allows in the same breath that plenty of people love the show and that it should certainly not be taken off the air, and then he draws the line he actually cares about, which is that they do not respect it in terms of writing. That distinction carries the entire feud, because nobody at South Park was ever arguing that Family Guy failed to be funny, or that its audience was somehow wrong to enjoy it. The complaint they were making is narrower than that, and considerably more insulting, since what they are saying is that the thing being produced is not writing at all. all. Stone's contribution to the same conversation is colder in a completely different way. He does not call the Family Guy staff untalented or stupid, and in fact, he says the opposite, describing them as smart people who know what they are doing. His objection is that they need to work harder, which is a worse thing to say about somebody than calling them incapable, because it implies the ability was always sitting there and simply went unused. Think about how a sentence like that lands inside a profession, because television writers are not judged primarily on whether audiences laugh. Audiences laugh at plenty of things the room producing them is quietly embarrassed by, and the judgment that actually matters comes from other writers, on craft, in rooms where everybody understands exactly how the sausage gets made. Telling that audience that a rival staff is talented but not trying is a status move rather than a review, and it is the one accusation a working writer cannot easily shrug off at a party. Parker also gave the aftermath a name on that same track, calling what happened after the first half aired an animation solidarity moment, a stretch of time where everybody in the business came together over a shared dislike of one particular show. The word solidarity is doing a great deal of work in that phrase, because it describes a group closing ranks, which is what happens when people believe something they hold in common is under threat, rather than merely being disliked. The fuller picture comes from a two-part interview conducted by Eric Goldman for IGN, published across the 17th and 18th of July in 2006, roughly 3 months after the episodes went out. That conversation is where most of the durable material in this entire story originally came from, and it covers considerably more ground than the commentary track does. They walk through what happened after the first half aired, and the picture they paint is of an entire industry quietly agreeing with them. They point out that South Park had already shown Muhammad 5 years earlier, in an episode broadcast on the 4th of July in 2001. The prophet appears as a member of a superhero team, alongside Jesus, Buddha, Moses, and several others, with no censorship and no incident of any kind. That precedent is the strongest card either man holds, and they play it repeatedly across the interview, because nothing about the character had changed between 2001 and 2006. Only the temperature outside had changed, and the network's tolerance had moved along with it. Answering that point is hard for anybody defending the decision. If a depiction was acceptable in 2001 and unacceptable in 2006, then the objection cannot really be to the depiction itself, and something else is being managed instead. The only honest name for that something else is risk, which is exactly the admission the whole two-part story was built to force into the open. They also mention that Comedy Central blocked them from reprinting the Danish cartoons inside a piece written for a serious magazine. The network was policing not only what appeared on its own air, but what its talent could publish somewhere else entirely. Stone states flatly that the risks involved had been totally overestimated by everybody making decisions, and he went further in a trade publication, calling the network president's decision cowardly in print, saying that on the record, in a paper every executive in Los Angeles reads over breakfast, is not a private complaint between colleagues. It is a public accusation aimed at a named individual by two men whose show happened to be the most valuable thing that individual controlled, and both of them understood the position they were speaking from. They were also in an unusually strong place to say it, because South Park was the property Comedy Central could least afford to lose, and everybody in the building knew it. Whatever the network thought about being publicly called cowardly by its own creators, removing them over it was never a serious option on anybody's list. That leverage runs underneath all of it, because Parker and Stone were not brave in a vacuum, and they were brave while holding the only card that mattered. The network president answered for the decision a few months later, at a press event in the middle of 2006, and his answer is considerably more honest than most executives manage in that situation. Asked directly whether they had overreacted, he said for sure, and added that history would probably show it. He framed the whole thing as a judgment call made under pressure, and said the company was willing to live with having made it. Very few network executives ever say that sentence out loud, because the standard move after a controversial call is to restate the principle behind it and refuse to revisit anything, since admitting error invites everybody to relitigate every decision made that year. He did the opposite in a room full of television critics, conceding the overreaction, predicting the record would confirm it, and then declining to apologize on the grounds that somebody had to decide something under pressure with incomplete information. That position is more defensible than it first appears, and fairness demands saying so plainly. Nobody at Comedy Central in April of 2006 knew whether putting an image on their network would result in an attack on a building full of people who had never volunteered for any of it. The Danish cartoons had already produced deaths in several countries, and deciding not to find out whether the same thing could happen in New York is a coward's choice or a responsible one, depending entirely on information that nobody actually possessed at the time. A separate interview with a libertarian magazine that December fills in the mechanics of how the episodes were made. That is where the detail about the fictional network president being named after the real one gets confirmed, and where Parker describes the decision to run a plain black card as doing the dry driest thing possible, which was entirely deliberate on their part. That choice matters more than it looks at first glance, because Parker and Stone had every tool available to make the censorship funny if they had wanted to. They could have covered the character with a cartoon bar, or a comedy sound effect, or a joke aimed at the network, and any of those would have earned a laugh and let the audience move on comfortably. Instead, the viewer gets a black screen and one plain sentence explaining what was removed and who removed it, with no music and no punchline, which leaves a person nothing to do except read it. The same piece records the promotional line Comedy Central ran ahead of the second episode, asking viewers whether television executives would take a stand for free speech, or whether Comedy Central would back down. Read that advertisement again with the outcome attached to it, because the network paid to broadcast a commercial inviting people to tune in and find out whether the network would lose its nerve. Then, it lost its nerve on the night, in front of the exact audience it had personally invited to watch for that reason. Nobody planned it that way, and the marketing department was simply selling a cliffhanger. What they accidentally sold was a live test of their own employer, and the employer failed it in the most publicly documented way available to anybody. The last major statement came 4 years later, around the show's 200th episode, in a conversation with a national newspaper. Stone described the relationship as a one-way war, saying Family Guy completely ignores them, and that this is fine, that neither camp knows anybody at the other, and that he did not think the other side was much bothered by any of it. Parker added that Family Guy was making considerably more money than they were, so he doubted anybody over there cared very much either way. Asked whether the show had improved at all after the two-part story aired, Parker said their show did not get any better, which is a small masterpiece of dismissal that repays a second look. The question invited him to claim influence, and most people would take that invitation, because saying a rival improved after your criticism is a way of taking credit while sounding generous about it. He declined the offer entirely and reported no improvement, no influence, and no engagement of any kind. The one-way framing does not quite hold up, and both men had good reason to believe it anyway. From where Parker and Stone were sitting, the evidence supported it completely, because Fox never issued a statement, no executive defended the show in print, and McFarlane did not answer in the trade papers. From the outside, it looked exactly like indifference, and they had no particular reason to imagine otherwise. What neither of them could see was that McFarlane had already answered twice, in places neither man was watching, once from a podium at a university 8 weeks after the second episode aired, and once on screen, buried inside a subplot 3 years after that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 8 weeks after the Manatees aired, Seth MacFarlane walked onto a stage at one of the most famous universities in the world, stood in front of a graduating class and their families, and answered the criticism in the voice of a cartoon baby. What he said was not a denial. It was stranger than a denial would have been. Section 5, the salute. At Harvard, only a handful of things exist a person can do when somebody insults their work in public, and most of them make the situation worse rather than better. Denying the charge hands the other side something fresh to argue with. Ignoring it entirely lets the accusation stand unchallenged for as long as anybody cares to repeat it. Hitting back generates a feud, which is exactly what the person who threw the first punch was hoping for in the first place. This is the story of the fourth option, the one Seth MacFarlane chose in front of a graduating class at Harvard 8 weeks after the Manatees aired, and why agreeing with your accusers turns out to be considerably harder to argue with than any denial would have been. MacFarlane delivered the Class Day address at Harvard on the 7th of June in 2006, standing in an outdoor theater in front of several thousand graduating students and their families, and he answered the biggest criticism of his career using the voice of a 1-year-old cartoon baby. The speech itself is a full comedy performance, rather than a few polite remarks, and he moves through several of his own characters across it, doing Peter and Stewie and Quagmire in turn, while working a crowd sitting outdoors on folding chairs. He was also, at that particular moment, one of the most commercially successful people in American television and the subject of the most talked about insult in the history of animation, and nobody in that audience was going to let the subject pass unmentioned. Choosing to address it in that room carried real consequences, because a Class Day speech gets written up in the papers and quotes from it travel. Whatever he said about South Park in front of several thousand people with press in attendance was going to become the official version of his response, and it would be the only version most people ever heard about afterward. He had exactly one opportunity to set the terms of the conversation, and he spent it agreeing with his critics. He set the answer up carefully before delivering it, referring to shows that seem to think they can get away with random jokes about giant chickens that have nothing to do with the overall narrative. That is his own show, described in his opponent's terms, by the man who makes it, entirely on purpose and in front of witnesses. Then he delivered the answer itself. The boys at South Park, he said, are completely correct about all of it. The cutaways and the flashbacks have nothing to do with the story, and they are only there to be funny. That is a shallow indulgence indulgence, which South Park is quite above, and for that, he told the crowd. He saluted them. Read the shape of that a second time, because it is a strange piece of work by any standard. He does not deny a single element of the charge, and instead states the whole thing as established fact, repeating Parker's exact complaint word for word in his own voice. Then he agrees that South Park does not do this, agrees that not doing it represents the higher path, and thanks the men who made the accusation for having made it. Nothing in the speech functions as a defense of anything. There is no argument that the cutaways secretly serve the story after all, no claim that the criticism misread the show, and no counterattack aimed at how South Park is written or made. He concedes the entire case and then applauds the prosecution. That response is considerably more effective than a rebuttal would have been, and the reason repays understanding properly. A denial hands the other side something to push against and keeps the argument alive for another round. Agreement leaves them holding an accusation the accused has already accepted, which is a much harder position to keep shouting from, because you cannot win an argument against somebody who has just told a crowd that you are right. Delivering it in character does the rest of the work, since the concession arrives from Stewie Griffin rather than from Seth MacFarlane, which means nobody can quite say he folded. The setting helps as well, because a commencement address is not a press conference, nobody in that field was going to ask a follow-up question, and the audience had come expecting a comedy performance rather than a statement. He answered the biggest criticism of his career in the least adversarial room available to him, and then moved on with the rest of the speech. 6 years later, he was noticeably less relaxed about the whole business, and he drew a distinction that changes how this entire story reads. Speaking to a music magazine in a piece published in December of 2012, MacFarlane said he thought the South Park episode making fun of them was funny and accurate, and he noted that the Simpsons and Family Guy camps had become friendly with each other over the years. Then he said what he did not understand was the personal venom Parker and Stone spread in the press about the show and about him. When none of it arrived in the context of a joke, he added that he would be interested to know where all of it came from, since he did not know either man personally. Nobody involved ever said anything more useful about this than that. The episode was fine, and he confirmed it twice in public across 6 years, describing it in his own words as funny and accurate. What bothered him was everything that happened outside the episode, where the same criticism arrived without a joke wrapped around it and started sounding less like comedy and more like straightforward contempt. The line he draws there is one most people in comedy would recognize instantly. Inside a joke, everything is available, and the target understands the terms of the exchange, because somebody taking a shot at your work in a sketch is playing a game you both signed up for. Outside a joke, the same words are simply an assessment delivered in public by a peer, and there is no game left to hide inside. MacFarlane is not complaining about being mocked at all, and what he is complaining about is being graded. He put it more simply on a radio show some years later, saying the whole thing came down to differences in taste between people who make comedy in different ways. One episode in this story shows how deliberately he avoided escalating, and it involves Britney Spears. In 2008, South Park ran an episode built around her that was brutal even by that show's standards, airing during the worst stretch of her public life, when photographers followed her constantly and her difficulties were being covered as entertainment by more or less every outlet in the country. Spears, who was a Family Guy fan, reportedly approached MacFarlane afterward and asked him to make an episode attacking South Park, with her appearing as a guest. He turned her down because he did not want to start a feud. The biggest escalation available to him, a celebrity-backed counterattack handed over for free by somebody with a genuine grievance, was declined on the grounds that taking it would make everything worse. What he did instead, when he finally answered on screen, was quiet enough that most viewers never noticed it happening at all. The episode is the third of the 8th season, written by Alex Sulkin and directed by Cindy Tang, broadcast on Fox in October of 2009, and while the main story involves two comedy legends moving to Quahog, the subplot is the part that matters here. Peter, Joe, and Quagmire form an improv troupe and start performing in front of a live audience. Improvised comedy runs on a small handful of principles, and the episode gets every one of them right. The rules are to stop thinking, keep the scene going, and build on whatever your partner hands you, with everything coming out of the moment and connecting to what somebody else just did. Quagmire takes those rules seriously and pushes the group to follow them properly. Peter ignores all of it completely. He walks on stage carrying pre-written material that has nothing to do with the scene in progress, drops it in anyway, and gets enormous laughs for his trouble, while Quagmire's character-driven improv, performed correctly, gets a middling response from the same room. The detail that gives the joke away is the sound of the laughter itself, because Peter's crowd response is mixed slightly too loud and slightly too clean, the way canned laughter sits on top of a scene rather than inside it. Quagmire's honest work gets a thinner, more scattered, more real reaction. A show can only build a joke that precise if the room writing it understands exactly what the criticism is and has spent time thinking carefully about how to answer it. Nothing in that subplot defends the cutaway, and it agrees openly that the the cutaway is a cheat. What it adds is that the cheat works, that audiences prefer it, and that being right about structure does not fill a theater on a Friday night. Quagmire is the correct character to lose that argument, because he is the one who takes craft seriously whenever craft comes up, which means the show is not mocking the position at all. It is conceding the position and then pointing at the audience. A second response gets badly mangled in most accounts of this feud and deserves correcting properly. In an episode from the 6th season, broadcast in January of 2008 and written by Wellesley Wild, a location called Anal Point appears on screen. The story that circulates online is that McFarlane depicted Trey Parker and Matt Stone there in a sexual situation, and none of that aired. A version of the comeback was storyboarded and animated and then dropped before broadcast, with McFarlane judging it weak and in poor taste, and the unfinished version survives only on a disc. That decision is more telling than anything that did make it to air. McFarlane had the material built, animated, and ready to go, and putting it on television would have escalated the feud instantly and generated an enormous amount of press coverage, which is usually the entire point of a comeback. He binned it instead, and the only surviving version sits on a home release as an unfinished animatic. Weigh the two approaches side by side, and the asymmetry stops looking like indifference. One camp built its response into 2 episodes and then repeated the criticism in interviews for the next 4 years running. The other wrote a comeback, looked at it, decided it was beneath the show, and threw it away without telling anybody. The last acknowledgement came a decade after the tank, in the 400th episode of Family Guy, broadcast in April of 2018. Peter runs through the show's supposed 60-year history and claims Sunday has meant God, football, and Family Guy for 6 decades, with The Simpsons arriving later and mattering considerably less. In the same episode, he mentions that the show has taken a few comedic jabs from the creators of South Park. Setting those two references side by side is the interesting part, because in one breath, Peter erases The Simpsons from television history entirely, and in the next, he cheerfully admits that South Park landed some hits. Even inside a joke, the show was still fighting one rival and had stopped fighting the other. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Almost every account of this feud treats South Park as the show that started it, and almost every account is wrong about that. Another series had been calling Family Guy a thief since the year 2000, and it put the accusation on screen in a single word. The flowers that arrived in Colorado in 2006 came from that writing room. Section 6. The word written under Peter Griffin. Some accusations are made loudly, in public, with an audience watching and everybody understanding exactly what has happened. Others get made quietly, in a single frame of animation that lasts about 2 seconds, aimed at the small percentage of viewers paying close enough attention to catch it. The second kind can run for years without ever becoming a story, which is exactly what happened between 2 shows on the same network long before anybody drew a manatee. This is the story of the accusation The Simpsons had been making against Family Guy since the year 2000, and why almost every account of this feud gets the order completely backwards. The first shot in this entire war was fired in February of 2000, in an episode of The Simpsons written by Ron Hagee and directed by Stephen Dean Moore, and hardly anybody noticed it at the time. The story sends Homer to a remote island as a missionary, and what matters here happens at the very end, inside a fake network telethon staged as a closing gag. Betty White appears on screen and appeals to viewers to call in if they do not want to see crude, lowbrow programming disappear from television forever, and as she says it, she reaches over and switches off a set displaying the Family Guy logo. Framing is what makes that gag work, because Betty White is not attacking Family Guy directly at any point. She is appealing for donations to save crude, lowbrow programming, and the visual joke is that she cannot bear to look at the example sitting right in front of her while she does it. Nothing about that construction is subtle, since The Simpsons is calling itself the respectable end of a category and pointing at the other end, which is a slightly awkward position for that particular show to occupy, given that The Simpsons spent its first several seasons being denounced from church pulpits and banned from classroom walls, accused of exactly the coarseness it is complaining about here. A sitting president of the United States once publicly wished American families were more like the Waltons and less like The Simpsons, and 10 years later the same show was on air asking its audience to notice the difference in class between itself and somebody else. The timing of that gag makes it sharper still, because Family Guy was in genuine trouble at that point. Fox had already been moving it around the schedule and was openly considering cancellation, and the show would in fact be canceled twice before its eventual revival. So The Simpsons was not punching at a dominant rival at all in February of 2000, and what it was doing was kicking a program that looked like it was already dying. Their next shot came 2.5 years later, and it was considerably more pointed. In a Halloween special that opened the 14th season in November of 2002, one segment parodies a comedy film about human cloning, and Homer acquires a hammock that produces copies of himself until the town is overrun with duplicates. The crowd of Homers is where the joke actually lives. Standing among them are several deliberately imperfect versions, including the crude prototype from the shorts that predate the series, a Homer defined entirely by his weight, a Homer with the wrong personality, and a Homer with no face at all. Peter Griffin is standing in that crowd. No caption was needed, and none was given, because Peter is simply standing among a group of defective Homer Simpson duplicates, and the argument completes itself. He is not being treated as a rival character with his own show, and he is being filed as a bad copy that got loose. Placing him in that specific group sharpens the point considerably, since the other defective Homers are all versions The Simpsons itself produced and then rejected along the way. Sorting Peter Griffin into that pile files him as one of the show's own discarded drafts rather than as a competitor from another network, and the insult is not that he is similar to Homer. The insult is that he is a version they already threw away. 3 years after that, the accusation stopped being implied and started being written down. The episode is the 8th of the 17th season, written by John Frink and directed by Mark Kirkland, broadcast in December of 2005, and it sends the family to Italy. At one point, Italian police leaf through a book of known American criminals, and each face in the book carries a caption in mock Italian, with Snake filed under home invasion, Mayor Quimby filed under drink driving, and Sideshow Bob filed under multiple attempted murder. Peter Griffin is filed under plagiarismo. The page then turns to Stan Smith from McFarlane's other series, and the caption underneath him reads, "Plagiarismo di plagiarismo," plagiarism, and then plagiarism of plagiarism, printed in a book of criminals on a Sunday night in front of a national audience. 2 seconds of screen time, and it contains a formal charge with no ambiguity in it anywhere. One show is stating on its own airtime that a rival copied it and then copied the copy, using a word that means exactly one thing, with no attempt made to soften the landing. A small joke sits buried inside the same scene for anybody paying close enough attention, because Sideshow Bob's prison number is the production code of that very episode. A show accusing another show of having no original ideas hid its own paperwork inside the frame while it did it. That episode drew a 3.7 rating and 10.3 million viewers, making it the 28th most watched program in America that week, which means 10 million people saw the word plagiarismo written under Peter Griffin 4 months before anybody at South Park drew a fish tank. Consider what it actually takes to get a gag like that onto television. A writer pitches it in a room, the room approves it, a showrunner signs off on the script, animators in another country draw it, Standards and Practices reviews the finished episode, a network broadcasts it to 10 million homes on a Sunday evening. At no point in that chain did anybody decide that formally accusing a rival program of theft, by name, in writing, was a step too far for a family comedy. The accusation was a production decision made by a large number of professionals who all agreed it should happen. The complaint underneath all of it has a specific shape, and both sides have a case worth hearing. One show established the modern American animated family sitcom, with an overweight and well-meaning and frequently idiotic father, a patient wife with unusual hair, a troublemaking son, an intelligent daughter nobody listens to, a baby who does not speak, and a suburban town full of recurring eccentrics. Family Guy arrived in 1999 with an overweight and well-meaning and frequently idiotic father, a patient wife with unusual hair, a son, an overlooked daughter, and a baby. Whether that constitutes theft or simply describes the shape the format naturally takes is an argument nobody is ever going to settle, since sitcom families had looked roughly like that since the days of radio. What is not arguable is that the people who made The Simpsons considered it theft and were entirely prepared to say so on television. The counter-argument deserves a proper hearing too, because it is stronger than The Simpsons writers ever allowed. Family Guy does considerably more than rearrange the same family, since its comic engine is completely different, its pacing is different, its relationship to reality is different, and a talking dog and a homicidal infant have no equivalent anywhere in Springfield. Two shows can share a silhouette and be doing entirely unrelated things inside it, and whether the silhouette itself belongs to anybody is the actual question, given that The Simpsons had borrowed its own from a long line of shows that came before it. They kept saying it in print as well, and the quotes are more interesting than the gags. Matt Groening took a defensive posture rather than an aggressive one when asked about it, allowing that Family Guy and American Dad had staked out their own style and territory. Then he noted that accusations were now flowing in the other direction, with people claiming The Simpsons was taking jokes from Family Guy, which he denied flatly. His answer is more revealing than a direct attack would have been, because Groening is not defending the plagiarism charge his own show had been making for 5 years. He is answering the reverse accusation, which means enough people were making it by that point that the creator of The Simpsons felt obliged to deny it on the record. 20 years after his show defined the format, the argument had turned around far enough that he was the one being asked whether he had copied anybody. Mike Rice, a longtime Simpsons writer and producer, gave the fullest account in a book about working on the show, describing younger writers in the room being incensed by Family Guy. Their complaints, as he lists them, were that it was vulgar, that it moved too fast, and that it was nothing but pop culture references from beginning to end. Reese found all of that funny and explains exactly why, because every one of those things had been said about The Simpsons when it started. The room objecting to Family Guy was staffed by people working on a show that had been accused of the identical crimes a decade earlier by an older generation of critics. His own summary of Family Guy manages to be generous and dismissive in the same breath, calling it The Simpsons after a few beers. He is warmer about MacFarlane personally than almost anybody else in this story, comparing him to Ned Flanders and noting that no matter how much The Simpsons writers berate him, MacFarlane remains warm and gracious and is always the first to admit his debt to their show. He also offers the sharpest one-line summary of the creative relationship that anybody has produced, saying MacFarlane looked at Homer Simpson and decided he needed to be bigger and dumber. Reese went further on a podcast years later, accusing the Family Guy opening credits of copying a specific musical sequence from a Simpsons episode. That particular accusation is unusually specific, which makes it considerably more interesting than the general grumbling, because he is not complaining about a family shape or a tone at all. He is pointing at one production number from one episode and saying the structure of it was lifted for a title sequence, and specific claims can be checked in a way that most of what gets said on both sides of this feud cannot. One caution belongs here, because this is where fan sources start filling the gaps in the record. Several other Simpsons writers get named online as prominent Family Guy critics, and those attributions trace back to a fan-maintained wiki rather than to anything either man ever said publicly. Reese and Groening are documented, and the others should be treated as unconfirmed until somebody produces a source. The jabs never fully stopped either. In November of 2024, an episode of the 36th season ran a parody of a novel about book burning, in which lowbrow television is banned and destroyed. The entrance to an underground society of people who still watch trash sits beneath the comic book store, with a door handle shaped like Stewie Griffin. 22 years after Peter appeared in a crowd of broken Homers, the same writing room was still filing Family Guy under garbage, in a background prop where only the people looking would ever find it. That persistence is the most telling detail of the lot, because feuds normally cool once the people who started them move on or leave the building. The Simpsons has cycled through hundreds of writers since 2000, and the joke survived every one of those changes, which means somebody who was not in the room in 2002 wrote that door handle in 2024. The position had stopped being a grudge held by individuals and had become part of what the show simply thinks, passed down, and maintained like any other piece of house style. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Seth MacFarlane answered that campaign exactly once, and he did not aim his answer at South Park. 75 seconds of his show's 100th episode were built to hurt The Simpsons specifically. They turned out violent enough that Fox pulled them off the air and ordered both writing staffs to stand down. Section 7. The ceasefire Fox had to order. A television network will tolerate a great deal of bad behavior from the people who make its most profitable programs, because those people are difficult to replace, and the alternative is worse. Writers insult each other in the trade papers. Showrunners take shots at rivals in interviews, and the executives above them generally let it run, since a small amount of noise between successful shows is free publicity for both. Every so often, something crosses a line far enough that the network stops watching and starts giving instructions. This is the story of the 75 seconds of animation that made Fox order two of its own writing staffs to stop fighting, and what the target of those 75 seconds reveals about how Seth MacFarlane actually chose his battles. Family Guy reached its 100th episode in September of 2007, which is the milestone a series normally marks with something celebratory, and MacFarlane marked part of his with the ugliest thing he ever aimed at another show. It opens as an imitation of a Simpsons promotional bumper, the short branded card a network runs between segments, with Marge Simpson appearing in it and waving at the audience in the standard friendly pose. A miniature Quagmire runs into the frame, and what he does to her is a sexual assault, staged and timed as a gag. The sequence then moves to the Simpsons house, where Quagmire produces a gun and shoots Homer, then Marge, then Bart, then Lisa, and then, after a deliberate pause held for the joke, Maggie. Describing that as light ribbing is impossible by any standard, since the entire principal cast of the most successful animated series in history is murdered on screen, and the mother of the family is assaulted first. The pause before the baby is the detail that shows how carefully the whole thing was built, because a writer put that beat in deliberately, knowing the audience would see the infant coming and that the delay was where the laugh lived. Somebody timed the murder of a baby for maximum comic effect, and an animator drew it, which means the sequence is not careless in any way and was precisely engineered to be as offensive as possible to one specific writing room. Fox cut it. The sequence never aired in the American broadcast, though it survives on a home release and turned up in some later cable and overseas airings, which is the only reason anybody knows it exists at all. The survival route explains a pattern that runs through this entire story, because material that networks remove very rarely disappears. It moves to a disc or to a foreign on broadcast or onto a commentary track, and the people who care enough to look will always find it eventually. Almost every revealing thing in this feud reached the public that way, including the uncut Quagmire sequence, the scrapped Parker and Stone gag, and the commentary tracks where both camps say what they actually think. None of it aired, and all of it is known. Reporting on the episode indicates the material badly upset senior people at The Simpsons, with James Brooks and Al Jean named among them. Brooks in particular explains the response, because he had produced some of the most acclaimed television comedy in American history before The Simpsons existed, won multiple Academy Awards for his films, and held a contract giving the show unusual protection from network interference. That contract is the reason The Simpsons has always been able to mock Fox on Fox, and a man with that much accumulated standing does not need to threaten anybody, because he simply has to be unhappy and the machinery around him responds. Reaching 100 episodes also explains part of the recklessness, since that milestone is the point where a series is generally considered safe, having accumulated enough inventory to be sold into syndication, which is where the real money in television has traditionally been made. MacFarlane was not writing from a defensive position in September of 2007 and was writing from the most secure place a showrunner ever occupies, and the material reflects exactly that. What happened next is the part that matters most, because Fox instructed the staffs of both Family Guy and The Simpsons to stop making fun of each other on air. Networks do not usually have to do that, and an order like that means the fighting had stopped being a publicity asset and started being a business problem, with two of the company's most valuable properties attacking each other in front of a shared audience on the same night. MacFarlane described the intervention on his own commentary track, and his account repays close attention. The executives told him they wanted to end the feud, and he found that suspicious enough to say so directly to their faces, telling them his reading was that the network was not afraid of Family Guy at all and was afraid of James Brooks. Naming Brooks is a specific accusation about how power actually works inside a studio, because the instruction went to both shows and was framed as mutual, while MacFarlane believed only one side had the leverage to demand it and the other side was simply being managed. His reading is probably correct, and the evidence sits in what actually got cut, since The Simpsons had been calling Family Guy a plagiarist on air since 2000, and none of those jokes were ever removed from anything. Family Guy hit back once, and the sequence was pulled from broadcast entirely. A truce requiring only one side to give something up is not really a truce at all, and what it is instead is an instruction delivered in language designed to sound even-handed. The order also arrived at a convenient moment for one party, because The Simpsons had already landed its accusation repeatedly across 7 years and multiple episodes, with the sharpest version broadcast to 10 million people 2 years earlier. Stopping the fight in 2007 locked in a scoreline, and MacFarlane had just made his first real attempt at a reply and was told to put it away. The episode still drew just under 8 million viewers, with the sequence removed from it, and removing it created the conditions for the material to become far more famous than it ever would have been otherwise. A gag that airs is simply a gag, while a gag that a network pulls becomes a story, then a rumor, then something people seek out deliberately and pass around for years afterward. Hold the target choice up against everything covered so far, because it is the most revealing decision in the entire story. South Park had portrayed his writers as sea mammals in front of a national audience, twice in consecutive weeks, and The Simpsons had filed him under plagiarism in a 2-second freeze frame. Between those two options, MacFarlane chose to build an extended murder sequence aimed at The Simpsons. The reason becomes obvious the moment somebody draws the map. The Simpsons aired on Fox on the same night, in the same animation block, competing for the same viewers and the same advertisers, and its writers had been criticizing him for years in public from inside the same building. Every one of those attacks was a shot from a colleague rather than a stranger. South Park was on another network entirely, in a different business, playing to a different audience, and hitting back at Comedy Central would have meant starting something rather than continuing something. It would also have meant escalating a fight with two men who had already demonstrated they were willing to spend 2 full episodes on it, so he punched sideways at the rival in his own house and left the one across town completely alone. Proximity mattered in a practical sense as well, because writers on Fox animated shows shared a great deal in that period, including some of the same voice actors, some of the same animation houses, the same standards department reviewing scripts, and the same executives deciding schedules. Feuding with a program you keep bumping into in corridors is a completely different proposition from feuding with one you will never encounter anywhere. A commercial logic sits behind that too, beyond anything personal. Attacking a Comedy Central show from a Fox show generates a story about two networks, involving press offices, executives, and lawyers on both sides. Attacking a Fox show from a Fox show is an internal matter that never leaves the building unless somebody decides to make it leave. MacFarlane picked the fight that could be settled in a conference room, and it still ended with the network ordering him to stop. The ceasefire mostly held after that, and both shows stopped aiming at each other on air, while the material that survived the order became noticeably milder. When the two finally shared a screen, it happened in the most controlled way imaginable, in an hour-long crossover broadcast in September of 2014 as the season premiere of The Simpsons, though it was formally produced and billed as a Family Guy episode. That production arrangement tells the story on its own, because an hour of television carrying both properties had to be assigned to one show for rights purposes, and it went to Family Guy, which means the newer program was formally hosting the older one inside the older one's own season premiere. Everything about that hour was agreed in advance by lawyers on both sides, and nothing in it could surprise anybody, which is precisely the difference between 2014 and 2007. Running through that crossover is the idea of Family Guy having stolen everything from The Simpsons, and the joke gets made repeatedly by both casts in an episode both studios approved and promoted heavily, which is a fairly remarkable outcome, since the accusation that produced a murder sequence and a network intervention in 2007 became, 7 years later, the agreed premise of a joint ratings event. Al Jean gave an interview about one specific joke in that hour, which shows how carefully the two rooms were managing each other. A moment involves Stewie making a prank call, and Jean explained that after the joke lands, every character on screen looks at him as though it was not funny at all. The whole idea, in his description, was that The Simpsons does not think that kind of joke is funny. They found a way to insult the other show inside an episode co-produced with the other show, and put it in the crossover everybody had been asking about for a decade. The economics explain why everybody agreed to it, because a crossover between the two biggest animated comedies on American television was worth an enormous amount of attention to both parties, and attention translates directly into advertising revenue. Whatever the two writing rooms thought of each other privately, an hour of television that large is not something either studio was ever going to refuse. MacFarlane, for his part, has never publicly complained about that 2014 episode, and the silence is consistent with everything else he does in this story. He absorbed the plagiarism accusation, agreed with the South Park criticism at Harvard, cut his own harshest comeback before it aired, and then co-produced an hour of television whose central running joke was that his show is derivative. Somebody keeping score would call that a losing record, and somebody looking at the ratings for both programs across the same period would reach a completely different conclusion. Both readings are honest, and both are available. In the argument about craft, conducted through commentary tracks and magazine interviews and awards ceremonies, MacFarlane lost comprehensively and mostly declined to contest it. In the argument about whether people would keep watching, which is the only argument a network cares about, he never lost at all, and Family Guy has now run for more than a quarter of a century. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. All of that fighting happened between two shows on the same network, where the stakes were commercial and the referee was an executive with a budget to protect. What happened in Colorado in April of 2006 was something else entirely. Nobody involved was competing with anybody, and three separate writing staffs reached out to a rival they had never met. Section 8. The Flowers from Springfield Agreement. Inside the television business almost never happens in public, because everybody working in it expects to work with everybody else eventually, and a public attack closes doors that people generally prefer to leave open. What happens instead is quieter and considerably harder to document, arriving through telephone calls and private messages and gestures that leave no record anybody can quote in an article later. Every so often, one show says out loud the things several others have been thinking, and the response tells you how widely the opinion was actually held. This is the story of what arrived at the South Park offices in the days after the first episode aired, and what it revealed about how the rest of the animation business felt about Family Guy. Flowers arrived at the South Park production office within days of Cartoon Wars Part 1 going out, and they came from the producers of The Simpsons. Telephone calls came as well, from the staff of King of the Hill, and the message attached to them was direct enough that Parker repeated it in interviews for years afterward, since they told him he was doing God's work. Consider how unusual that actually is, because three separate writing staffs, working on three different programs, at two different companies, in a business where nobody has any spare time at all, each decided independently that somebody ought to be told well done. Nobody organized any of it, no letter went around, and no campaign existed anywhere. One show said the thing out loud on television, and the others responded privately within a week. Privacy matters as much as the gesture itself, because none of these people made a public statement about any of it. No showrunner went on the record backing South Park, and no press release went out from anybody. The support arrived through a florist and a telephone, in a form that left nothing behind for a reporter to quote, which is how professional agreement usually travels in an industry where everybody eventually needs a job from somebody. Parker and Stone were unusual, precisely because they had no need to care about any of that. They owned their show, they were not looking for staff positions anywhere, and they were never going to be hired by another network in any case. Their contract structure sat behind almost every decision decision they made in 2006, because two men who own their program and answer to a single network can afford to publicly call that network cowardly, refuse to remove a scene, and dare the executives to do something about it. A staff writer on a show owned by a studio has none of those options available, whatever they privately think about anything. On the season commentary track, Parker gave the moment a name, calling it an animation solidarity moment, and he described what it revealed as considerably broader than either show. His claim was that a large part of Hollywood at the time resented Family Guy, partly over what they considered lazy writing and partly out of straightforward jealousy about its ratings. He also made a comparison that lands harder the longer you look at it, saying the people at The Simpsons hate Family Guy more than he and Stone do. Coming from him, that is a considerable statement, since Parker had just spent 2 episodes portraying the rival writing staff as aquatic mammals in a tank, and is describing himself as the moderate position in the room. Take that claim seriously for a moment, and the reason becomes clear enough. Parker and Stone were describing a show they found lazy, while the Simpsons staff were describing a show they believed had copied them and then beaten them with the copy. Those are different injuries, because one is an aesthetic objection about craft, and the other is closer to being robbed, and people do not get over the second one the way they get over the first. Those flowers also explain 2 things inside the second episode that make no sense otherwise. Bart Simpson appears in that story as an ally rather than a target, a fellow traveler who hates Family Guy too and helps Cartman get inside the building. The chase later rolls through the offices of King of the Hill, another animated series, for no plot reason whatsoever. Both of those were written in after the first half aired, because both of those shows had made contact, and Parker put the 2 rooms that backed him directly into the episode they had backed him for. One detail about King of the Hill carries a sting the Bart cameo does not, because King of the Hill was a Fox animated series sharing a network, a night, and an audience with Family Guy. Its staff were not commenting from a safe distance about a program on somebody else's channel, and they were talking about the show airing next to theirs, competing for their own viewers. King of the Hill also sat at the opposite end of the animated comedy spectrum from Family Guy in almost every respect, being slow, grounded, built around a small cast of consistent characters, and nearly free of pop culture reference. Its humor came from people being exactly who they were in situations that developed at walking pace. A room writing that show had every structural reason to object to a program built on interruption, and no commercial reason at all to say so publicly, since both series depended on the same network for their existence. So they picked up a telephone instead. Their objection would also have been the most credible one available had anybody made it publicly, because King of the Hill was the show with the least to gain from the argument and the strongest claim to standing on the other side of it. Nobody outside a few offices ever heard from them, and the strongest witness in the whole case never testified, which is how the record ended up so lopsided in the end. Everybody in animation seemed to hold roughly the same opinion in the spring of 2006, and exactly one show was willing to put its name on that opinion in public. Consensus without a spokesman leaves no trace behind, and had Parker stayed quiet like everybody else, the entire disagreement would have lived and died in private conversations between writers with nobody outside the industry ever knowing it happened. All of which points at the part nobody involved ever said out loud, and it has very little to do with comedy. Every animated comedy on American television in the middle of the 2000s was chasing the same finite resource, which was a slot on a Sunday night, and those slots are the most valuable real estate in the medium with a fixed number available. Family Guy had come back from cancellation, which almost never happens to anything, and taken one of them. It was doing enormous numbers using a format the other rooms had considered and rejected on principle, and it was doing that while several of those rooms watched their own audiences soften. Professional resentment nearly always arrives dressed as an argument about craft, and occasionally the argument about craft happens to also be correct, and both things were true at the same time here, in a way that is probably impossible to separate even for the people who felt it. Nobody was ever going to say it out loud either, because saying it would have undercut everything else. An argument about craft is respectable and worth having in public. Complaining that a competitor is taking your audience is just business, and business complaints do not make good television. The honest test is what would have happened if Family Guy had failed. A show using the same format and drawing modest numbers would have been ignored entirely by everybody, because nobody spends 2 full episodes attacking a program nobody watches. Success is what produced the attack, which does not make the criticism wrong in any way, though it does explain the timing, and the timing is the part nobody involved ever addressed directly. One more thing about the flowers matters, which is who sent nothing at all. Fox said nothing. No executive defended Family Guy in print. No statement was issued by the studio, or the network, or the show, and the program that had just been portrayed as a tank of sea mammals in front of a national audience made no corporate response whatsoever. Reading that as indifference is the obvious move, and it is almost certainly wrong, because answering would have made it a story. A statement from Fox generates follow-up calls, a headline in the trade papers, and a running item that lives for weeks, while saying nothing keeps the manatees inside somebody else's episode where they belong to South Park rather than to the news cycle. Risk asymmetry explains the decision completely. Family Guy had nothing to gain from a public fight and a great deal to lose, because it was the show accused of being poorly written, which meant any argument about its writing was taking place on unfavorable ground, no matter how well anybody conducted it. South Park occupied the opposite position, being the smaller and less profitable program, with a reputation for saying whatever it liked, and a public feud with the biggest cartoon on television was free publicity. Neither side was being cowardly or brave, and each one behaved rationally given what it had to protect. One had an enormous audience and a fragile critical reputation. The other had a modest audience and a critical reputation built entirely on refusing to back down, and both were defending the thing that mattered most to them. Time settled it in a way neither could have predicted. The public record of this feud is now almost entirely South Park's version, because South Park is the only side that kept talking about it, and 2 episodes plus 4 years of interviews plus a commentary track produced the account everybody repeats today. Family Guy's side exists mostly in things that were cut, buried in subplots, or said once at a university, and a show that says nothing does not get to write the history. Not everybody stayed quiet, and the loudest objection came from a direction nobody expected. The president of a Catholic advocacy organization attacked the episodes, though not for the reason anybody assumed, because his complaint was not that South Park had failed to show Muhammad. His complaint was hypocrisy, aimed squarely at Parker and Stone rather than at the network. His argument ran that the network deciding not to show the prophet was the network's call to make. The real hypocrites, in his account, were 2 men who accepted the money, complained loudly about being censored, and then went straight back to mocking Jesus, which he characterized as their entire commercial proposition. Whatever else it is, that is a serious charge, and it is not a stupid one, because a show positioning itself as fearless while operating inside limits set by somebody else is standing on unstable ground, and he found the weak point immediately. The counter-argument is straightforward, and Parker and Stone made it repeatedly. Since they did not agree to the limit at all, they delivered the episode with the image intact, refused to remove it, and the network overrode them afterward, and being censored is not the same thing as consenting to censorship. Where the charge does land is on the aftermath, because Parker and Stone spent years describing the incident as proof that networks fold under pressure, and they were right about that. They also stayed at that network, kept making the show, and renewed with it repeatedly across the following 2 decades. Both things can be true at once, since a person can be censored, object loudly, and then continue working for the people who did it, because the alternative is not working. They answered him the following year by turning him into a villain in an Easter episode, which is the only response they have ever really had to anybody. Notice that as a pattern rather than an incident, because their entire method of engaging with critics is to put the critic in the show. It is an effective tactic, and it has an obvious limitation, since answering criticism by making a joke about the critic works beautifully as television and never once engages with whether the criticism was correct. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Underneath the manatees and the flowers and the plagiarism jokes sat something considerably heavier, and it had been building for 6 months before Trey Parker wrote a single word of either episode. 12 drawings published in a Danish newspaper had already killed more than 100 people by the time Cartoon Wars aired. Section 9. What the Manatee War was actually about. Sometimes a joke about a rival turns out to be the surface of something considerably larger, and the thing underneath only becomes visible once enough time has passed for everybody to stop laughing. 2 episodes about a cartoon writing staff made of sea mammals were, at the same time, 2 episodes about whether an American network would broadcast a drawing while people in other countries were dying over drawings. The Family Guy material was real, and Parker meant every word of it, and it was also sitting on top of a story with a body count attached. This is the story of what those 2 episodes were actually about, and of the fight that came back 4 years later and nearly got somebody killed. A Danish newspaper published 12 editorial cartoons at the end of September in 2005, several of them depicting Muhammad, and it did so deliberately to test whether artists in Europe had started censoring themselves out of fear. That single decision produced one of the largest international crises of the decade, and it is the entire reason Cartoon Wars exists at all. Following the sequence properly matters, because most retellings compress 6 months of escalation into a single sentence. Through October of 2005, the response stayed domestic and largely procedural. A Danish Islamic organization demanded an apology. Ambassadors from 11 Muslim countries requested a meeting with the Prime Minister and were turned down, and around 3,500 people demonstrated peacefully in Copenhagen in the middle of the month. None of that was violent, and none of it was particularly unusual. That opening stretch is the part almost everybody forgets, and it is the part that matters most for understanding what came afterward, because for roughly 3 months, the entire dispute dispute proceeded through ordinary channels. Complaints were filed, meetings were requested, people marched peacefully, and then went home. Had it stopped there, nobody in California would ever have heard about any of it, and cartoon wars would never have been written. In November, the cartoons began appearing in other European papers, and in January, a Norwegian magazine reprinted them. Boycotts of Danish goods started across several countries, and the original newspaper issued an apology through an agency in Jordan at the end of the month. February is when the whole thing broke apart. Papers across Europe reprinted the images in solidarity, including outlets in France, and demonstrations turned violent in several countries at once. In Damascus, a building housing the Danish, Swedish, and Chilean missions was stormed and set on fire, along with the Norwegian embassy. In Beirut, the Danish consulate was attacked, and protests spread to London and across much of the world within days. The death toll from the riots reached at least 139 people, with some estimates approaching 250. Almost none of those people had any connection to Denmark, or to the newspaper, or to the cartoons themselves. They died in demonstrations in countries with no involvement in the original decision, over drawings the overwhelming majority of them had never seen. That gap between the cause and the casualties is what made the story so difficult for editors everywhere, because reprinting the images asserted a principle while also carrying a real and demonstrated risk to people who had no say in the matter at all. In the middle of that month, at a rally in Peshawar, a prayer leader announced a bounty for killing the cartoonist responsible, and members of the congregation added to it, offering $1 million, 1,000,000 rupees, and a car. Trey Parker sat down to write 6 weeks after that. Even the episode title came out of the coverage, since a news channel had run a caption reading "Cartoon Wars" over a report about Muslims angered by a cartoon, and Parker took the phrase directly off the screen. Hold on to that through the rest of this, because it changes the register of the two-parter completely. The manatee tank plays as a comedy bit about a rival cartoon, and it sits inside an episode written while the body count from a cartoon controversy was still being revised upward. Parker was not making a point about comedy in the abstract, and he was making it while the specific question of what a cartoonist is allowed to draw was producing funerals. South Park also had a precedent that nobody at the network particularly wanted to discuss. On the 4th of July in 2001, in an episode built around a team of religious superheroes, Muhammad had appeared on South Park alongside Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Krishna, Joseph Smith, and Lao Tzu. He speaks, he is visible, he has powers, and completely nothing was censored. Look at the lineup in that scene, because it makes the later panic look absurd, because every one of those figures is treated identically, all of them given powers and dialogue and jokes, with no single faith singled out, and none of them spared. Nobody objected in 2001. The episode was not controversial, it was not protested, and it ran for years in reruns without incident. Watching it now is a strange experience for anybody who knows what came afterward. The character appears, does his job in the story, throws a few jokes and leaves, and nothing about the scene treats him as dangerous or special, because in 2001, nobody involved thought he was. 5 years later, the same network refused the same depiction of the same character on the same show. Nothing about the character had changed, only the outside world had, and the network's tolerance had moved along with it. Parker and Stone spent the next 4 years pointing at that gap, and in 2010, they went back and tested it again. The episodes are the 5th and 6th of the 14th season, broadcast a week apart in the middle of April, and the story brings back every celebrity South Park had ever mocked, led by Tom Cruise, who sue the town and demand to be given Muhammad. He is moved around in a hire van, then in a bear costume, obscured throughout by a box reading censored. Everybody involved knew the premise was a deliberate provocation, because 200 episodes of accumulated grievance arrive in one place, which lets the show restate its entire history of offending people while raising the one question its network had refused to let it ask. Sharpest of all is the bear costume, since a character is hidden inside a mascot suit so that a censored box can be placed over a figure the audience cannot see anyway, which is a fairly precise description of what the network had been asking for since 2006. After the first half aired, a small New York group posted a warning online, written by a man using an assumed name whose legal name was Zachary Adam Chesser. The post said Parker and Stone would probably end up like Theo van Gogh, the Dutch filmmaker murdered in the street in Amsterdam in 2004 over a short film about the treatment of women in some Islamic societies, and it included a photograph of his body. It also listed addresses, one for the network's office in New York and one for the production studio in California. That Van Gogh reference was chosen precisely because it required no explanation from anybody, since everybody working in media in 2010 knew what had happened in Amsterdam, where a filmmaker was shot and stabbed in daylight with a note pinned to his body. Invoking that case alongside an address communicates everything a threat needs to communicate, while allowing the person posting it to claim afterward that they had merely made an observation, which is exactly what Chesser did. Comedy Central's response to the second episode went considerably further than any anybody expected. Every spoken mention of Muhammad was bleeped, and the character himself stayed behind a censored box, all of which followed the precedent set in 2006 and surprised nobody at all. Then, the network bleeped the closing speech. South Park ends most episodes with a short monologue explaining what the story meant, and the one at the end of that episode is delivered by Kyle, Jesus, and Santa, and its subject is intimidation. It never mentions Muhammad, and it never mentions Islam, and its argument is that fear works, that threatening people with violence produces results, and that this is why everybody behaves the way they do. Comedy Central removed the entire thing. Parker and Stone put out a statement saying it was not a joke on their part, that the speech was about intimidation and fear, that it did not mention Muhammad anywhere, and that it got bleeped regardless. A network spokesman confirmed that Comedy Central had inserted the bleeps and that South Park had not. So a speech arguing that people capitulate when they are frightened was silenced by people who were frightened, which is either the bleakest possible outcome or the most complete proof of the argument anybody could have staged. Comedy Central's position, to be fair to them, was never that the speech was wrong, and nobody at that network ever claimed Kyle's argument was incorrect. The decision was about physical risk to employees inside two buildings whose addresses had just been published next to a photograph of a murdered man. An executive weighing that is not conducting a debate about free expression at all. They are deciding whether to accept a small chance of something catastrophic happening to staff who never volunteered for any of it, and the honest answer is that most people in that chair make the same call. 15 years later, the consequences are still visible in what anybody can actually watch. 5 South Park episodes remain withheld from streaming, including the 2001 superhero episode, both parts of Cartoon Wars, and both halves of the 2010 pair. Every one of them involves Muhammad, and no other episode in the show's run is affected in any way. They vanished during the move to one streaming service around 2019 and 2020, and they did not return when the American rights moved to another service in the middle of 2025, which leaves a disc as the only official way to watch any of them. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because the single most quoted criticism ever made of Family Guy exists inside an episode that cannot legally be streamed on the platform carrying every other episode of the show it appeared in. Nobody has ever formally announced that decision either. No press release explained the omission, no executive has been quoted defending it, and the episodes are simply not there, with asking why producing no answer from anybody. 15 years after the last of them aired, the position has hardened into something quieter than censorship and considerably more permanent, since a choice made under threat in 2010 has become an administrative default that nobody has any incentive to revisit. That may be the most significant outcome in this entire story, and almost nobody discusses it, because Comedy Central never announced a policy and no rule was ever written down anywhere. A series of individual decisions taken under pressure across 4 years simply accumulated into a permanent absence, and 5 episodes of one of the most watched comedies in television history are effectively unavailable, with the reason never stated by anybody holding the authority to state it. For a show whose entire reputation rests on saying whatever it wants, that is a considerable footnote to end up carrying. South Park spent nearly 30 years positioning itself as the program nobody could control, and the record now contains 5 episodes it is not allowed to show. A petition circulated in the middle of 2025 asking for the release of what it described as 17 withheld episodes, and that larger number gets repeated widely online. It is not confirmed by the company and should be treated carefully, since the 5 Muhammad episodes are documented and everything beyond them is unverified. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. For an episode carrying this much reputation, the award record turns out to be completely empty, and almost everything people believe about how it was received is wrong. What the 2-part story actually left behind is a single word. That word ended up in the mouths of the writers it was invented to insult. Section 10. The manatees outlived the argument. Most feuds in entertainment end the way most arguments between adults end, which is that nobody apologizes and nobody concedes, and eventually the people involved simply stop bringing it up. The record afterward gets written by whoever kept talking the longest, the details blur, and the original disagreement turns into a piece of trivia that everybody half remembers and almost nobody can source. Occasionally something stranger happens, and the two sides end up needing each other for reasons that have nothing to do with the original fight. This is the story of what the Manatee episode actually left behind, and of the invoice that quietly ended a war nobody ever formally declared over. Cartoon Wars never won anything, which surprises people, because the 2-part story carries the reputation of a landmark, and reputations tend to collect awards behind them over time. Search around online, and you will find the episodes credited with Emmy recognition fairly regularly, and the record says otherwise. South Park's Emmy nomination in 2006 went to the episode about Scientology, and the following year the show won for an episode about an online role-playing game, which was the 8th episode of that same 10th season and aired 6 months after the Manatees. That award was handed out in September of 2007 as part of the Creative Arts ceremony in the category for animated programming under 1 hour, and it was the show's 7th nomination and its 2nd win. The Muhammad episodes that did eventually get nominated were the 2010 pair, 4 years later, so the 10th season won an Emmy, and it won it for an episode about a video game rather than for the 2-part story everybody remembers, and Cartoon Wars was never up for anything at all. The winning episode repays a moment on its own because it demonstrates the very thing Parker had been arguing about. That story follows the boys spending months grinding inside a video game in order to defeat a single player, and every joke in it comes out of that situation directly. The premise generates the comedy, and removing the story leaves nothing behind to tell. An Academy handed a trophy to the clearest possible demonstration of the therefore and but rule, 6 months after Parker built a fish tank to explain it. A small irony sits inside the nomination record as well. The Academy nominated the 2 episodes censored by their own network in the year they were censored, which is about as close as an industry body ever gets to making a statement about a matter it holds no formal position on. It did not nominate the earlier 2-part story that had raised the same question first and been overshadowed by a joke about a cartoon dog, which is the pattern this whole story keeps returning to, because the Family Guy material in Cartoon Wars was a subplot attached to a much larger argument about censorship, and it swallowed that argument whole. Reviewers wrote about the Manatees. Audiences quoted the Manatees. Nearly 20 years later, people who can describe the tank in detail frequently cannot say what the episodes were actually about. The critical reception was strong, even without any hardware to show for it. Eric Goldman gave the first half a 7 out of 10 at IGN in April of 2006, then gave the second half a perfect score and an Editor's Choice Award a week later. Entertainment Weekly ran a piece by Scott Brown on the day the second half aired, making an observation that is held up better than most contemporary coverage. The Muhammad material should have been the flashpoint of the whole affair, he noted, and instead, everybody in the country was talking about Family Guy. That was true in April of 2006, and it remains true today. What the 2-part story actually left behind is not an award or an episode at all, and what it left behind is a phrase. In October of 2007, roughly 18 months after the episodes aired, somebody added an entry to an online slang dictionary for the term manatee joke. The definition describes a joke format popularized by Family Guy, involving little or no connection to the plot around it, and explains the origin, which is a South Park parody suggesting the show is written by manatees pushing floating colored balls with cultural references printed on them. That entry marks the moment the insult stopped belonging to South Park and became a general-purpose tool available to anybody. 18 months is a very short time for a joke from one episode to acquire a dictionary definition, even an informal one, and it happened because the term filled a real gap in the language. Critics had needed a compact way to describe plot-irrelevant humor for years and had been making do with entire paragraphs, and Parker handed them a single word attached to a memorable image, and words like that do not go back in the box afterward. From there, the phrase spread through criticism and comment sections and eventually into ordinary conversation, with reviewers reaching for it whenever they wanted to describe a show whose jokes could be shuffled without loss. It became shorthand that worked perfectly well for people who had never seen the episode, and eventually for people who did not know it came from an episode at all. Then the strangest thing in this entire story happened, which is that the Family Guy writers started using it themselves. On their own commentary tracks, discussing their own episodes, members of that staff began referring to their own material as manatee jokes, self-deprecatingly and casually, in front of an audience of fans who had paid money for the disc. Writing rooms do not usually do that. A room that considered the criticism baseless would never adopt its vocabulary, and a room that felt wounded would avoid the word entirely. Using it as ordinary shop language means something in between, which is that the term described the process accurately enough to be useful, and arguing about its origin had become more trouble than it was worth. Writers do this with insults more often than outsiders realize, because a term describing a real thing accurately will get adopted regardless of who coined it or why, since rooms need shorthand, and shorthand is scarce. Precision beats pride when there is a script due on Thursday, which means the deepest evidence that Parker's criticism landed is not sitting in any interview either man ever gave, and it sits in the people he attacked using his word for their own work. The war actually ended right there, without an apology or a truce, because the losing side absorbed the insult into its workflow and got on with the job. A final piece arrived 19 years later, and it came from the man whose writers had been drawn as a manatee farm. At the end of July in 2025, Seth MacFarlane appeared on a podcast about the entertainment business, roughly a week after South Park had opened its 27th season with an episode about a sitting president that generated an enormous amount of attention. He was asked about it and could easily have said nothing interesting, and he he praised them instead. McFarlane started by protecting his own people, saying he would never trade his animation team for anything on Family Guy, which is a fair thing for a man to say about the crew he works with every day. Then he talked about South Park's production cycle, that roughly 2-week turnaround from idea to broadcast, and called it kind of amazing, adding that any show lasting that long is pretty astounding. He also explained in the same conversation why his own show cannot work that way, since Family Guy takes somewhere between 10 months and a year to produce a single episode, which means the writers are guessing at what the world will look like by the time it airs. He added that the guessing gets harder every year that passes. Nothing in that answer is defensive, and it plainly describes the structural difference the entire feud was about, since one show can answer the news and the other has to predict it. Plenty of people read the compliment as backhanded, and the reading is defensible, because he is admiring their speed rather than their writing, and the remark about longevity applies at least as much to his own show as to theirs. The timing sharpens it further. South Park had just produced an episode about a president that dominated news coverage for days, made using a method that allows the show to respond within a fortnight, while McFarlane's series operates on a schedule measured in months and physically cannot do that. Praising the speed was the one compliment available that did not require conceding anything about the writing, and he found it. Then came the part nobody predicted at all. McFarlane's series about a talking bear needed a version of Bill Clinton for an episode in its second season, which arrived on a streaming service in March of 2026 and is set in 1994. Getting the face right turned out to be considerably harder than anybody expected, and McFarlane has explained that they tried prosthetics and they tried conventional computer-generated effects, and that both approaches produced something that looked terrifying rather than convincing. The technical reason for that is well understood by anybody working in the field, because human beings read faces with extraordinary precision, and the tolerance for error is close to zero on somebody familiar. A face that is 90% correct does not read as 90% convincing, and it reads as wrong in a way viewers find deeply unpleasant, which is the opposite of what a comedy needs. For a joke to work, the audience has to accept the face instantly and then forget about it entirely, and anything less means they spend the scene looking at the effect instead of listening to the dialogue. So the production hired a company called Deep Voodoo, a visual effects studio based in Los Angeles, specializing in the kind of software that replaces one person's face with another, convincingly enough to survive close inspection. Deep Voodoo was founded by Trey Parker and Matt Stone. The visual effects supervisor on the show confirmed the arrangement and described why that particular company was chosen, explaining that their approach understands how a face actually works and how it speaks, rather than simply pasting an image over somebody's performance. Read the whole shape of that. In 2006, Trey Parker built a machine to argue that Family Guy was assembled rather than written, and put it on television for 2 consecutive weeks. In 2026, Seth MacFarlane's production paid a company owned by Trey Parker to run software that assembles a human face. Nobody staged any of it as a reconciliation, since no announcement was made, no joint interview happened, and neither party has described it as the end of anything at all. A production needed a specialist effect, a company existed that could deliver it, and an invoice was raised and paid. Quite possibly, nobody in the room thought about it for a second. Visual effects vendors get selected by supervisors and producers on the basis of capability and cost, and the person choosing a face replacement house in 2025 was solving a technical problem rather than settling a 19-year-old argument, which is the least dramatic and most likely explanation available. The feud did not end because anybody decided to end it, and it ended because enough time passed that the people involved stopped being characters in a story and went back to being professionals with work to deliver. Step back far enough, and the whole thing turns out to be smaller than its reputation and considerably stranger. 2 episodes in April of 2006, a tank holding 5 manatees named Gretchen, Flubber, Tigger, Pete, and Lucy, flowers from Springfield, and a telephone call from Arlen, a speech at Harvard where the accused agreed with every word of the accusation and then thanked the men who made it, a plagiarism charge that predated all of it by 6 years, a murder sequence a network refused to broadcast, and a word that escaped into the language and came back wearing the uniform of the people it was aimed at. Underneath all of it sat a real disagreement about whether a joke should be attached to anything, and neither side ever won that argument because neither side was really competing. South Park still turns an episode around in about a week. Family Guy still cuts away to a thing that reminds Peter of another thing entirely. Both shows are still on the air, decades after every prediction that neither of them would last, and the argument simply stopped being worth having somewhere between the black title card and the invoice. Neither side changed its method by so much as a single episode, which suggests that both of them were right about themselves the entire time and only wrong about each other. 2 writing rooms spent nearly 20 years disagreeing about the difference between a story and a list, and the disagreement outlived every executive who ever tried to manage it. Neither side changed its method by so much as a single episode along the way. The manatees outlived the argument they were built to make. People who who have never seen either episode still reach for the image, usually aimed at some other show entirely, and most of them could not tell you which cartoon it came from or that it was ever about Family Guy at all. Gretchen, Flubber, Tigger, Pete, and Lucy have outlasted almost everybody who argued about them, since the executives moved on, the critics who reviewed the episodes moved on, and the writers who sent flowers left the rooms they sent them from years ago. Somewhere in that fictional world, the tank is still sitting in a Fox office. 5 sea mammals pushing colored balls into a chute inside an episode Comedy Central will no longer let anybody stream. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.